In this video, we're going to talk about child physical abuse of a genital nature, okay? And I am inspired to make this video because I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and there have been more women speaking out how they were abused in the church, in the Mormon church specifically now. We already know about the Catholic Church, and now the Mormons are starting to speak out. When it comes to child abuse is actually very common. I also see a lot of videos about parents who abuse their children. Right now, what's really in the news is Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt. You might want to Google that. Ruby Franke and her husband had a famous YouTube channel with 2 million followers called 8 Passengers. They're a Mormon family with 6 children, and they were very abusive to their children. Jodi Hildebrandt is a therapist that many Mormon bishops sent their church members to, and she is a sadistic, psychopathic child abuser. These children escaped from her home, and that's how the whole thing unraveled. The police got involved, and now both women are in custody and just entered plea agreements. But we know that child abuse is very rampant, and specifically now I want to talk about the sexual parts. We do not know how many child abusers there are, but let me just give you guys some statistic. The most common perpetrators of child abuse of any kind are the parents of a child. And it's usually the mother. And this is why I don't like it when people are like, oh yeah, women are so great. The mother is the greatest perpetrator of child abuse. In 2001 in the United States, the number of children abused by the mother, 210,000. The number of children abused by their fathers, 132,000. The number one abuser of children is the mother. And if you're kind of interested in kind of what goes on, is there's a book called A Child Named It, which is a book that a man wrote who, when his case was taken up by the Child Protective Services, was the greatest child abuse case history in the United States at that time. And now I've never been abused. So you are listening here from someone who has just read about it or heard about it, but has not experienced it. And also that's an advantage for me because I can tell you what it feels like to be loved and to love my children. But also it might be good for you to listen to some traumatized people to hear what their childhood was like. The Crappy Childhood Fairy is a channel from a woman who experienced childhood PTSD. Her parents were alcoholics, and they would go and leave her for days at a time and not feed her and stuff. And she still has PTSD at this point when she's in her 40s or 50s. The Crappy Childhood Fairy. So that's just general child abuse. Now let's go into sexual abuse. The CDC in the US reports that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys in the US experience child SA. I'm just going to call it SA. Now, who are these people doing the SA? It's people that the child knows. It's usually a parent. It's usually a father or a stepfather. More than 90% of abusers are people the children know, love, and trust. 30 to 40% of victims are abused by a family member. 50% are abused by someone outside of the family who they know and trust. Evidence that a child has been SA'd is not always obvious, and many children do not report that they have been abused. If you have been abused, there's a National Sexual Assault hotline, RAINN, RAINN.org, but you can Google it. There are hotlines that you can call and to have someone to talk to about it. Now, I'm going to link in the description of this video an interview I watched on Mormon Stories podcast where a woman who's in her mid-30s now and is a therapist herself talks about the childhood SA she experienced at the hands of her father from the time that she was 2 years old. 2 years old. And how do we know? Because people don't have memories of 2. The reason we know is because when this little girl, she was abused by her father, who's a Mormon bishop. So don't give me this bullshit about these priests being so holy. They hide. And these people and organizations protect these predators because they want other people to look at their organizations, whether it's a church or whatever, as being above reproach and to be admired and looked up to. And in order to maintain that ego stroke of we're so good, we're so perfect, they diminish the voices and hide away anyone who speaks out about how they have been abused through that organization. The church, the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, all of them. Because they don't really care about people, they care about protecting their own image. And even in families, a lot of families are like, we don't talk about it. Our ego must be protected at all costs, that we're this perfect family. And they don't care about the children. But this particular woman, and I want to pull up the video so I can tell you exactly the name of it. Okay, her name is Chelsea Goodrich, and I want to say that it took an immense amount of courage, and I'm sure a lot of work she's had to go through in order to even admit this to anyone, much less to come out publicly and to give all these details. You know, because when this happens to people, when they're violated in this way, there's so much shame and there's so much guilt. And the people that were abused as children in this way, they usually suffer from intense depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, nightmares, panic attacks. And when they get close to being in a relationship, they will start having, like this woman, intense migraines, where she would end up in the ER, and this man that was so in love with her, and they'd never even been sexual, said, I really want to love you and marry you, but every time I start talking about developing our relationship, you end up with a migraine in the emergency room. That's how deep that trauma is embedded in every fiber, that relationships seem threatening. I wonder if I can even play some of this now. All right, so now I'm going to play a clip from this interview from Chelsea Goodrich. And before I play the clip, though, I wanted to tell you that the sexual abuse that her father did on her started when she was 2. The reason we know this is because her mom started noticing that Chelsea was having some behavior issues. I don't know if it was bedwetting, that's a common one, or something else. And the mom, bless her heart, took Chelsea to a therapist. And this would have been back in the 80s. And the therapist said there's definitely child sexual abuse happening. And so the mom never suspected her husband, the father of Chelsea, to be the abuser. She just started being very careful who Chelsea was around. You know, was it like a teacher or a neighbor or a babysitter, you know, that kind of stuff. But it was the dad all along. And then he started doing things with her in the swimming pool and then getting into bed with her at night. And the abuse escalated until it ended in some kind of penetration. And that's when the dad was like, whoa, I do not want to get my daughter pregnant. And he went to the bishop to repent. The bishop was ready to like spill the beans to the police, but he called the Mormon hotline and was told to shush it all up. So that's how the church covers it up. And also, when Chelsea finally, she was already going to graduate school for her master's in counseling, when she was having a discussion with her mom and said, "Oh, well, I know sometimes dad's a jerk. I don't care about that as much as I care about the stuff he did with me in bed." And the mom's like, "Whoa, what are you talking about?" And Chelsea told her mom, and her mom was upset. And the dad's like, "Oh, I already repented to the bishop. This is all behind us." And the mom's like, "No, this is not behind us at all." Um, there was a lawsuit. I think there's an NDA. Somehow now she's speaking about it publicly. I don't know all the legal details, but what is very obvious in this clip I'm going to play is, even though she's worked through all this and to the point where she can speak about it publicly, um, you can tell that she's very distraught as she's recollecting these memories, that it's painful. So let's listen to that clip, and then I'll be back on the other side.
Totally alone in this experience. I think that really the reason that my dad came to make that confession to me when I was 9, I'm not saying that he had no remorse at all. I don't really know, but I can tell you that the effect of it was that I was trained from that point on that this was between my dad and me. Mm-hmm. And that we weren't talking about it with anyone else. Yeah. So, as close as I was and am with my mom, and told her everything else that was going on in my life, I never told her about any of this because I think that had been well established between my dad and me, that this was not something that I was to talk about. And I will say too that because he had come and told me at age 9 that he was sorry and had repented of whatever he'd done, that I didn't necessarily associate that with what was happening when he would come and get in the bed with me, because I thought, well, my dad, he's trying to be a good dad. Whatever he did that was bad, he's sorry for, he repented of it. So I'm guessing whatever he's doing now can't be bad. I just don't like it. I don't like it. I'm uncomfortable with it. So uncomfortable. Felt grossed out, but I thought, this is my problem. This is my problem.
Okay, so over the years, I have met friends or worked with people in coaching who have told me about their own childhood sexual abuse. And the first memory I have of someone telling me this was when I was like 21 years old and I was going to college. And one of my friends in college told me that her father did things to her sexually, and her father was the president of the University of Kansas. And I was shocked because I thought those kinds of things only happen among like homeless people and uneducated people and criminals. I have over the years met other women. One woman who was sexually abused by her father for years. He was on a city council of one of the cities in Orange County. I will not say which one. And she was so messed up. Her dad abused her until she was from the ages of like 8 to 15. And then she stopped talking to her parents. She was so messed up. And then in order to get back a relationship with her mom, the mom said, and the mom protected the dad. It's like, "Oh, if you want a relationship with me, you have to have a relationship with her dad." And she said that every time she went to her parents' house for dinner after that, her skin would just crawl when her dad sat next to her. She had a huge drug addiction. Even though she was a successful scientist, she had a huge drug problem. And she would go through men every 3 weeks. Like, she was a wreck. And I only knew her because she was like a friend of a friend. There was another woman whose dad was like an English professor at a community college. I've also talked to men who were sodomized by their stepfathers, grandfathers who stuck their penises in the granddaughter's mouth. There have been what are some other examples? Sodomy for sure, of boys. And the sexual abusers are almost always men. Women do different kinds of abuse. I mean, like teachers will take advantage of young male students. That's sexual abuse as well. So I'm not talking now about the teachers. I'm talking about the family members. Oh, and then I have a friend who wrote a book, and I read her draft. And in the draft, she talks about being abused. She wouldn't say who it was, but I could tell from the book it was her brother. And I told her, and she was embarrassed because she loves her brother. And this is what I came to take away from. First of all, when the abuse happens, first of all, people are afraid to tell anyone because they think no one will believe them. So the number one thing that you have to do when someone tells you this is tell them, I believe you. Because someone who was abused and is not believed is doubly traumatized. I did meet a guy who was an alcoholic, and he was sodomized in the army. And when he went to tell his superior officer, the officer wouldn't believe him. And you know what this guy told me? He goes, the sodomy was bad, but was even more painful to me was when they didn't believe me. Okay, so that's a double trauma. So people don't want to say because they think it's their fault. That's another thing. The kid thinks it's their fault that they did something. So they feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. They don't want to tell because they're also protecting the predator, protecting the brother, protecting the uncle, protecting the grandfather, the stepfather, and the father, protecting. Like Chelsea on the video, this was between me and my dad. I wasn't allowed to tell my mom. I had to keep the secret to protect the dad. Not knowing that it's wrong because they're helpless children, not knowing how wrong it is. Protecting the predator because it's a family member that they also love. Imagine you love this person who's beating you or sexually assaulting you. So that's a huge head trip that messes with your ability to trust in relationship when the person that you love is hurting you and violating you. Not being able to tell anyone, having to keep the secret to yourself, blaming yourself, having to protect the predator. And then also, a lot of times when people are sexually touched, they do get aroused. You can't help it. Now you're getting aroused, even though you feel grossed out at the same time. And now you feel doubly dirty for getting aroused, and you think it's your fault for liking it. Like there's so much fucked up head shit that goes on in there. And children are so impressionable, and they're so vulnerable, and they're so helpless. They're relying on the adults to protect them. And often the adults don't see what's happening, but I've also heard of cases where the adult refused to believe the child. Now, Chelsea's mom did believe Chelsea when she finally said it. But she was blind to it all these years. She didn't notice her husband was crawling in her daughter's bed for years, and that her daughter was acting up. She never even thought to suspect her husband. I know another case where someone was sexually abused by a stepfather, and when he told the mother, she denied it. She said, I don't believe you. Oh no, initially the mom said, I believe you, and she had to talk with the stepdad, and the stepdad denied it. So the mom came back the next day and punished the boy for lying. How could you say that? This never happened, because some women are so codependent on these men, like the wife of the guy who was on the city council of a very prominent city in Orange County, California. And she didn't believe the daughter either. Some of these women are so enmeshed with abusive perpetrators, they want to protect the man at all costs. So they will not believe the child. And children do not make this stuff up. Children do not make this stuff up. So I will tell you my only experience with being nearly assaulted as a child. So I was visiting I was with my grandparents on a vacation, and my grandparents had a horse with like a carriage and a sled and all that. So they kept it in the stable next to where their summer home was, or winter home was, their condo. So I would often go in the stable, and there was this young man, kind of good-looking young man, who would clean the stables, and he would often talk to me. Grooming, they call it, actually. He would talk to me, and I would talk to him. And that one time I was in the stable, he picked me up, and I was probably 6 or 7. He picked me up and he held me in his arms and he went into one of the back room stable areas and he just started holding me and telling me he loved me and he wanted to marry me. And I was pissed. I'm like, put me down, put me down. I started yelling. And I think I scared him because I could easily have ended up, assaulted and done away with. That's what some of these guys do. He put me down. I ran immediately to my grandparents. I'm like, this is what this guy did. My grandmother didn't say a word. She got up. She was probably in her 60s. She got up, she walked out, and she went to talk to the owner of this vacation place, or the owners, and she got that guy fired. And he was gone. She said, he's fired, he's gone, and I never saw him again. And this is a thing that stays in my memory so much. And I have such gratitude for my grandparents because not only did they believe me, they protected me. I'm like, my grandparents are never going to believe this. This is like the craziest story ever. They are not going to believe me. Now, there's another thing that I want to point out, and this is not victim blaming at all, but the fact that I had the confidence to scream, put me down, this is not okay, and I was mad. A lot of kids, now this is different because this was not a family member, so I think that made it better maybe, or easier, but these kids that are groomed by someone outside the family, like a Boy Scout leader or someone at church, they don't have that confidence that I had. These groomers and predators that are non-family members, they will select someone who was already abused at home, who was already neglected at home, and they will ask you questions like, so, do you have a father at home? Does your dad spend time with you? They were looking for people who are already abused, because a child that was already abused at home has a prey mentality. They don't have the confidence to stand up for themselves, and they're very vulnerable to being abused by people outside the home. And so that's how parents who abuse their children set them up to be abused over and over and over throughout life. This is not victim blaming. This is just how predators operate. But the thing that people have to know is that the abuse is not their fault. Okay, these people who are attracted to children and to powerless beings, they were also abused in some way. They're just recycling their abuse. And I think what we really need is, I don't yet even know if these people can be helped through therapy. I've read some things about it. It's almost like they cannot be changed. They should probably be castrated, honestly. But they leave a permanent mark on these people throughout life. I mean, you read about women in their 60s who are only now realizing that they were abused as children. And when I talk to men whose wives don't want sex, the women were often sexually abused. And when they were sexually abused, there are certain sexual acts they do not want. Like oral sex, they will not do oral sex on a guy because it reminds them of when that was done to them. Or they won't want someone to go down on them, or they don't want to have any kind of physical intimacy at all because it triggers all the trauma. Even certain words and discussions can trigger the trauma. For example, say that you were abused while you were having a picnic at the lake. If someone says picnic at the lake and you start having trauma responses, that could be why. It'll bring back memories that are so deeply buried. It can happen, you can have a flashback when someone just says certain words that bring up memories of this abuse. Because a lot of this abuse, when people are abused, they often dissociate. And so they compartmentalize, they repress the memories as a way of being able to survive through it. And these memories are hidden, but they can come up through certain triggers. Also, when they are being sexual, they will dissociate. So women who were sexually abused, they will either want no sex at all, or they will be hypersexualized. Like These porn actresses with 2 penises in their ass and all that weird, crazy stuff, they do violent sexual acts in commercial porn. These women were all sexually abused, I'm sure of it. There's nothing sensual or authentic about it. They dissociate, they act, they perform. They're not embodied. They do not know how to be their body. It doesn't feel safe. It's important for all of us to get to where we feel safe in our bodies and can regulate our emotions. And for kids that were abused, sexually or otherwise, they don't feel safe in their bodies. So I think there's like trauma therapy, somatic therapy, and deep work. Talk therapy is the worst because you're just reliving your trauma and you're just reliving it without working through it, because it's deep in the pores of the being and stored in the body. And so the work has to be done somatically through the body. And, I think we all have to do a really good job of protecting kids and being aware, if our child is acting out, it's because something bad is happening. They will act out. Bedwetting, depression, cutting, looking for attention all the time from strangers, shutting down, like any kind of changes in behaviors in your child, you really, really have to pay attention. And, we have to protect our children. This is, very sad. If you have experienced anything like this, just maybe watch some YouTube videos on it to see that you're not alone. Call like one of these hotlines so you have someone to talk to, so at least you can get some relief and get someone to believe you and start your healing. Look for someone experienced in this kind of therapy that actually works. And, and I'm really sorry that happened to you. You have to know that it wasn't your fault and that these people who were supposed to protect you are criminals and should be in jail. And I'm sorry if this happened to you. And I'm grateful that it never happened to me, because I see how common it is and the devastating lifelong impact on people from this kind of violation. It's not fun. Sex is fun for adults. I love sex. But when you're forced into it by someone that you don't want touching you, and then when it's done to you as a child, before you even have sexual thoughts and desires, you're not ready for that. You don't want that. It's a completely different experience. Okay? And this is as much as I've tried to understand it from an outsider's point of view. So thank you for watching my video. And again, I'm going to link that other video in the description. If you want to watch the interview with Chelsea Goodrich. Bless her heart for being so brave and speaking out and holding this abusive father of hers accountable.